I'm going to show you how to play playoff DFS on DraftKings and FanDuel like a pro, and we're starting right now. What's up, guys? Welcome to another daily fantasy sports video. If you want to become a profitable DraftKings player and get better at betting, start now by subscribing to the channel, but make sure you hit that notification bell so you don't miss anything along the way. And if you're already a Holkamaniac, you know exactly what time it is. Smash that like button and we will get rolling. Today's going to be a little bit different. We're going to actually replay probably my favorite stream I've ever done on Twitch. So it is going to be diving deep into DraftKings and FanDuel playoff DFS strategy. And make sure you stay here until the end of the video where I give you my top tip, the one thing that you have to be profitable on these specific slates. Hope you enjoy it. I do want to kind of go through this because I think it's a really good story. So last year in particular, my strategy is to play anywhere from 3 to 10 lineups or so. I think this year I'm probably going to play 8 to 10. I played 3 in a couple slates last year because I really wanted to try and get up to the Wildcat, a little bit of bigger bankroll this year. So I'm probably going to play like 6 to 10 teams. I haven't decided yet, but that's a little different than my normal strategy, right? So I'm going to be playing more teams and then probably going to play everything Wildcat and down to try and really build in upside with tournaments that are larger field, big payouts up top, and a lot of it has to do kind of with what has happened to me over the last couple of years. So it's actually crazy. 2 of my biggest hits ever were on the exact same day, January 13th last year, or I guess technically, well, I guess barely last year, 2018 and 2017 on January 13th on these on the division round slate. But this is still a really good story. So basically, in this slate in particular, started with 3 teams, and one of the things that I did want to kind of go through was exactly what the situation was, because it was so similar to what we have on this slate in particular, the one that we're about to talk about. There was one game that was really popular, and it was the first game of the slate. And one of the things that I think is super important on these playoff slates is the game number, right? Is it the first game? Is it the last game? That's something that we really have to pay attention to. So started with these 3 teams. I'll get into that in a minute. But if we go back over to the Vegas page, this was the Vegas page on that day last year. So pretty similar, right? So the first game on this slate was the New England Patriots and the Tennessee Titans. If we go back to the other kind of contest dashboard here and get out of my lineups, we'll see that Eric Decker, Dion Lewis, James White, these are the kind of some of the players that were really popular, and they were in that first game. Gronk was 46%, Tom Brady was 36%. So like those were the really chalky plays, and I think that it's going to be pretty similar this week, in particular with the Houston and Indy games. So I think there's a lot of parallels to this slate because we do have kind of a gross game. The second game on the slate last year was Philly and Atlanta, kind of a lowest total on the slate. I actually think that there's a chance that this Seattle and Dallas game, the second game for this week's slate, is pretty similar. This is going to be a lower pace, probably lower scoring. You're going to maybe want pieces of it. But as far as game stack, I love that the second game is a little bit less appealing outside of Zeke for obvious reasons. But it shapes up really well. And then we had the third game was like the game that no one really wanted to play, right? Jacksonville and Pittsburgh. Obviously, Jacksonville, pretty elite defense last year. Guess who the third game is this year? It's Baltimore and the Chargers. So very similar. No one wants to play Rivers. No one wants to play some of those weapons, Keenan Allen, against this Baltimore defense. Similar even on the other side of it. So if people were playing Bortles for Jacksonville, we have someone like Lamar with a ton of rushing upside. So that game is extremely similar. And then the third game was a pretty popular kind of trendy game, and I actually think that could happen this week with Philly and with Chicago. So this one was the Minnesota and Saints game. We know what happened at the end of this game, the big Stephon Diggs touchdown. So all this kind of comes into play, and it's very, very similar to this slate. It actually makes me excited because of how similar it is. So hey, Denver, I appreciate that, man. Shout out on Twitter to his DFS people. Hey, no worries, man. Appreciate it. Any kind of help you can really does a lot. Steve with the 5 tier 1 gifted subs. Shout out Steve. Just gifting a ton of subs lately. Just been crushing it. Appreciate it, man. Hey, SPX333, Denver Heart DU, Cal Mafia, OT Josh, Unk4423. Hey, shout out shout out Steve for the gifted sub. Steve's the man. And Reddit Cheek with the 100 bits. Appreciate that. Looking forward to the slightly smaller slates the next few weeks. It's smaller slates, but there's still a lot of kind of differences for sure. Tuesday says sick brag of the 3K followers. Awesome. So, all right. So that's basically my point is this slate that we have this week is very similar to this one. So going back to what I did last year, basically looking at the 3 lineups I made, I basically had one pretty much all out game stack from the first game, overstacked it, some may say. So I went Brady, Lewis, Hogan, and Gronkowski, brought it back with both the value wide receivers for Tennessee who were extremely popular. So this team was doing extremely well after the first game. So a lot of the really kind of sharp players were on this game. It was a game that had a ton of value. So a lot of people were game stacking this. And after the first game, it looked like those teams were the ones that were going to win all the money. So these other 2 teams that I had, I was going to the Vikings and New Orleans game. So from very early on in the week, I was kind of biased, right? I wanted a Minnesota game stack just to go out there and sweat the game, brought it back with Kamara. Vance was kind of a sneaky, cheaper tight end that I really liked. So he was in there as well. Did have Eric Decker and Tennessee defense from that first game. Tennessee defense at 2K was a big part of that. And then just had another kind of stack that I think that this was a decent amount of late swap throughout the way. So there's 2 ways to do this. Approach this first game that's going to be popular. It's overstack it. If it does end up being kind of the game that goes off, hopefully you've got that covered and you've got some pieces around it. Like Le'Veon Bell is in this lineup. So something like Zeke in that lineup. So depending on what you can make work, I think that that's how it is. So the second game, I mentioned Atlanta and Philly, didn't do a whole lot. So I had an Ertz team in here. I had a Julio team. So this team was way behind. This team was also way behind with Case Keenum and the Minnesota stack. So my team that was wide open was this Minnesota stack team. So shout out John Proctor and all the guys over at Power Hour. We did a show kind of going through late swap, just like what we're going to do with Evan Silva on Sunday. And what we decided kind of as a group was we really wanted to target this kind of gross game that no one wanted to play. We wanted to play this Jacksonville and Pittsburgh game and really see what we could do with this wide open lineup that I had where I had a lot of value. I had Decker, I had Tennessee defense at super cheap prices. I actually had James White, which is somewhat interesting because I think we have a situation like this as well. I think we're going to have a guy like Marlon Mack who's going to draw a lot of ownership in that first game against Houston. I actually think Nyheim Hines is super interesting as like the pass catcher. He's cheaper, has a lot more DraftKings upside. Like that's like the James White play to me. So basically, I should probably bring up what actually happened with some of these. If you're enjoying this replay today from a live stream over on Twitch, come join us live next time. We're constantly diving into situations just like this, playoff DFS, other sports. We're going to be breaking down things like NHL soon as well. So make sure you hit that follow button and the notification bell so you don't miss the next time I go live. It's really the best way to get involved in the community. And definitely check out the Discord as well. That's where the conversation goes on past the YouTube videos, past the Instagram, past these live streams. So that's the best way to kind of get to know me on a personal level. I'll see you guys in there. All right, we'll do that in a second, I guess. I think there's a different way I can go about doing this, but I'll show you that once we get to what my pivot was. So my big decision was, what did I want to do with this team? And I ended up switching it. We'll go to this other line, this other tournament where I had my other team. I ended up switching it to Ben Roethlisberger, Le'Veon Bell, Antonio Brown, Vance McDonald, brought it back with Leonard Fournette, and then had Stephon Diggs in the popular game number 4. So what that allowed me to do, Ben at 7%, Antonio at 9%, Vance at 4%, Fournette, relatively popular, but nowhere near some of these other plays that were in some of the later games. So obviously this game ended up going nuts. I think it was like 45-52 or something nuts like that. So got these guys at really low ownership. Who was the team that could pass the New England stacks? And to me, that was Ben. And all these studs for Pittsburgh that were going to go lower owned against this really strong defense. So I was in a really good spot, was basically winning all the smaller field stuff with Stephon Diggs to go. Where my mistake happened, and kind of one of the lessons from this story, is I basically only switched this team in half of my contests. I kept the Minnesota game stack in the biggest contest, obviously the 250K to first. I kept this game stack with Minnesota because I got scared. I really liked this Minnesota stack. It was this Jacksonville defense who was just dominant. And that was a massive, massive mistake. So I'm sitting there after the third game in an awesome spot, still feeling fine, honestly, just because my team wasn't to the point where I really thought that I was in striking distance for anything like the Millie Maker and striking distance for anything like the Wildcat. With only Stephon Diggs to go, still thought that I was in a pretty decent spot, even without that. So Diggs had like a relatively good game, couple catches here, couple catches there. And then we know what happened next, right? Ball goes in the air. All I'm thinking on that last pass from Keenum was just get out of bounds. Catch the ball, get out of bounds, end the slate, right? Because probably had a team that was good enough for second, third in most all of the smaller field contests that I was in. Diggs catches it, just daylight, runs in the end zone. I'm standing in the end zone. When I post this article tomorrow, I'll check it out. I've got actually a video from my phone. One of the cooler experiences I've ever been a part of as far as a live sporting event, just being at that game, like thinking about his celebration, like still gives me chills to this day. So there was like a lot of celebrating, obviously like a crazy moment. And then as soon as I go to check my phone just to see what happened, like I instantly, like I can feel it, like my face getting hot. I can feel the anxiety because I know that I didn't leave this team in every tournament. So I'm sure if you guys have been playing long enough, if you've had something like this where you have a massive score, you kind of check around to see what you would have done in some of the bigger contests. So I open up my phone. Before, I think I was up like, I don't know, 11, 12K or something, like a really awesome week. Open my phone up, 24K, and instantly I know like this is not good. Like this team probably would have done some damage in some of these bigger tournaments, right? In the Wildcat. So my score, let's see what it was. Final Four, leaderboard. So by the way, this tournament had 300,000 people in it. I finished in 8th with this team. So my score was 231.36 points. If we just go to the Wildcat, what did I say, 231? 231.36, Wildcat. So would have placed second place in the Wildcat with that team. But guess what team I had in this? The Case Keenum team. It's tough, guys. I don't wish something like that upon any of you guys. But I guess the moral of the story is awesome slate, made a lot of good, like kind of good pivots. I'm always going to think about that game and wonder why I kind of didn't have the stones to pivot all my teams over to what the correct play was, right? So just looking at the teams that I had two teams, obviously, that didn't have the main stack that had gone off already. I didn't have this New England, Tennessee exposure that did really well. I didn't have it on either of those teams. Did pivot one of them to Bortles, which was fine. That team didn't do anything, obviously. But I really wanted this Minnesota stack, who was like really popular. And like to me, maybe this ends up being the Chicago stack that ends up being kind of trendy. Like Minnesota stack was super trendy in this week. I still wanted part of it. I was going to the game, blah, blah, blah. But 15% owned, 20% owned, 23% owned. Kamara, 15% owned. This team was not helping me pass this already chalky New England team. So the correct play was what I did on this Final Four team. I think I had this in maybe the small Wildcat, something like that. Like still awesome. Great. I'm not trying to be like poor me for what happened. I'm trying to explain to you guys that like the correct play was always to pivot to this Ben Roethlisberger at lower ownership. It was always the play to just give yourself a chance to pass this chalky game, this first game that did extremely well. So some regrets for sure. That I mean, looking back on it, the only thing I kind of like hold on to is like I know that I was going to play the Minnesota stack no matter what. And there's a chance that if I wouldn't have split up my shares of the tournaments, that I wouldn't have played this team at all. Wouldn't have played this Roethlisberger team at all. So obviously super fortunate that I had this team in the tournaments that I did. Awesome week. Great. But just want to kind of tell you guys that making those swaps, that's how you win in the playoffs. Every single game that happens, we really need to kind of make sure that we're looking to kind of build in this way and give ourselves a chance if things go wrong early. So hopefully that wasn't too long-winded, but I think it's kind of an awesome story to go through that. And awesome for you guys because it didn't happen to you, not so awesome for me. So one of the cooler moments, I mean, living in Minnesota, not a Vikings fan necessarily, but one of the cooler moments in the city, people talk about it all the time. I still like don't have a lot of great memories from it, unfortunately. Like it was great, but I'm still always going to think about that I basically left 100K plus on the table. Second in the Wildcat, would have won the power sweep. I'm instantly getting texts from people that are just like, dude, seeing my score or whatever and being like, man, you would have won all these, like all this stuff. So you can say that in a lot of weeks, but this is the week where I actually think that it's a kind of valuable discussion to have. So basically, that's kind of what I wanted to start with. And the best thing kind of that I think you can do in these slates is really give yourself outs. Like how was I able to even make that swap? It's because I had a team that was relatively wide open. I had pieces of this chalky game. I had James White. I had Eric Decker, who was like a cheap value play. I had Tennessee defense and kind of built as I went here. Like I think there's kind of two ways you can go about it. You can do something like that where you make kind of a decision after these first two games what gives you the most leverage, or you can kind of build with mini stacks. And the year before, I ended up with a team that was more similar to this one, kind of little mini stacks. Like so, this one was kind of interesting. I played Dion and James White together to kind of try and give myself kind of a unique roster construction, but little mini stacks. Like had Ertz to Julio in this one, had McKinnon and Case Keenum to hopefully get those touchdowns. So like the little mini game stacks, I think is another good way to do it in the postseason. But in general, I think that you're building your team with information that comes new every game that ends. And the best part about the postseason, for me at least, is there's plenty of time to think through leverage. There's plenty of time to think through what you should be doing with these teams. From an ownership perspective, you have a pretty good idea if you're behind. If this team that has all these players 31% owned, 40% owned, 41% owned, 24% owned defense, if this team does well, or you see teams like this do well, so if you see this week, if you see the Indy-Houston game go nuts and you have some teams that are wide open, you gotta make moves. Like give yourself a chance. Don't be one of those people that plays these postseason slates and just is like, well, slate's over. Like you never know if you're gonna fall into this game that no one thinks is gonna shoot out. Maybe no one really thinks this Baltimore LA Chargers game is gonna shoot out. Maybe no one thinks this Chicago Philly game is gonna shoot out. So that's how I'm thinking about the playoffs. That's how I build lineups. That's how I've had the most success on these slates. So any questions with any of that in the chat? I haven't really been watching. I just kind of wanted to get that out. But hopefully that was kind of helpful for you guys. Laker, what's up, man? How you doing? That specific one. Yeah, so I think you were probably watching that show with Johnny Laker. So like every pivot we talked about on that show, if anyone was listening, and we said a lot of the stuff that I just said, right? Like give yourself a chance if you're light on New England and Tennessee. We were basically like, this is another part of it that I guess I probably should have mentioned. Like tell yourself a story that this game script smashes this team. So basically, let's go back over there. So this game script, if Fournette gets a touchdown early and Jacksonville really tries to lean on the run, there's a chance that Jacksonville's not passing a ton and Pittsburgh's behind, just stacking up all these pass catchers. Obviously, Le'Veon Bell, someone that's active in the passing game as well. Like that's how the upside of this game really goes nuts, and that's what happened. So we talked about that in the pivot show. We were like, I'm pivoting basically all my Julio to Antonio Brown, something like that. Or I'm pivoting all my, sorry, I must have been Minnesota guys. So I'm pivoting all my Thielen to Antonio Brown, finding a way to get to Antonio Brown and Fournette over guys like McKinnon, Case Keenum, who was like a cheaper guy people were on. So that's how that happened. And that show was probably one of the best pivot shows ever. So hopefully Evan and I can recreate that for you guys. Can't really see the margins with the iPhone thing. Oh yeah, so that's probably an issue, huh? I'll fix that for the next one. Hopefully we just get the actual streaming computer back. That would be ideal. Do you play less or no cash games this week than the regular season? Yeah, I don't play any cash in the postseason. I mean, you can approach it the same way. I just would rather have more exposure. Let's make one thing clear. I don't care if I lose every dime on this slate. Don't care at all. I want to have a chance to have a score, because I think this is the week where you do have a legitimate chance to get to the top of tournaments, because people are not playing these right. So I don't care if I lose every dollar. And I think that one way that makes sense for cash is something that I've been a proponent of for a while, that I've talked about on these streams. It's maybe you play like 33% of your action on your tournament teams, play them in double ups. So if that you miss the cash line and you hit your double ups, you don't get absolutely buried. You at least get some of your entries back. I think that that's totally fine. So that's something that if you want to play a little bit of cash, I would say that is the way to go. I want bullets though. Like, I don't want one cash team, because then you're really like, it's harder to make this type of Pittsburgh pivot when you only have one team. For me, like even in this week, I had 3 teams. It was a little bit easier to kind of make that call. And one thing too, like someone else asked me earlier in the week, they were like, well, why wouldn't you just play 150 max and max enter the slant and the milli or the half milli or whatever they're playing? And for me, like, yeah, you have time after the second game to really evaluate where you're at, but you still need to be making switches after this first game as well. So to me, that's too much to manage. Like, there's tons of global swap type stuff that you can do, but like the way that at least I think is the best way to win money on these slates is to really make sure that your leverage, your correlation is correct, and gives you a chance to really get up top. Like, this is another type of slate too, where like playing a naked quarterback, it's really tough for you to get to the top of the tournaments, in my opinion, just because you really need to have like that correlation play that goes off. You need that Ben Roethlisberger to Antonio Brown that no one has. You need, like, even to some extent, like you needed Tom Brady. Maybe you were going to bring it, kind of bring in someone like Chris Hogan. I don't even remember who scored points for New England. I just remember it was a popular game. So you need the stack. So if that stacks Luck to Hilton, if that stacks Watson to Hopkins, if that ends up being the top stack of the week, it's really hard to do that with a naked quarterback, in my opinion, on a smaller slate. So correlation's even more important on smaller slates, I would say. So I hope that was helpful. I kind of, in a roundabout way, answered your question, Mr. Jackbox. So Steve asked, so you made 3 teams total. You would discuss making 8 to 10. Yeah, so played less teams last year. Just the bankroll was a little bit different. But after the slate, instantly, like halfway through it, that's kind of part of the reason I switched from 3 teams to 6 teams after that first half. Is instantly I was like, wow, I wish I would have made more teams. So this year I'm going to do, I think, 8 to 10. And it's whatever you're comfortable with. But I think that that's a really solid number where I still think I'll be able to manage it in between games, in between slates. And by the way, they don't have to be teams that are completely different, right? So if you think there's a lot of great value in one of these first games or second games, like you can play the same team in both of these. If you get behind, you can make your pivots in, like, leave yourself flexibility to make moves in the last 2 games, right? So you don't have to have a unique team, I guess. You don't have to start with a unique 8 teams from the first 2 games, if that makes sense. Make moves, Pitts versus Jacks last year. What's up, Chad? How are we doing, man? Any considerations to using multiple slates with different strategies? Yeah, so there's definitely different ways you can do it. I think it's still doable to do these with like the 2-game slates, for sure. I mean, if you're playing Showdown, it's definitely another way just to feel better about not having exposure to a play that you really like if you think one of your tournament teams is behind. So that makes some sense for sure. And yeah, the Saturday and Sunday slates are interesting. Like that's another way to do it, right? If you want to still attack this Indy Houston game, maybe you kind of are a little bit over leveraged on the 2-game slate in from that perspective. Because if if this first game really goes off and this Seattle Dallas game is really low paced, you're completely buried. So that if you really want to get your exposure to this first game, I think I would have it probably a lot more exposure to it on the Saturday slate, just because I think you really handcuff what you can do if you don't have flexibility. And if it doesn't work out, like the way this slate absolutely buries me, which we'll talk about, is if someone like Marlon Mack goes nuts, right? So we'll talk about that. But I wanted to get out kind of all of the strategy stuff first. Do you multi-enter the same lineup in anything for multiple swap options? Yeah, so I think I'm a little bit behind on the chat doozy, but that's kind of what I was trying to describe. So like, so last year, I think something like having Decker, who was a cheap option in one of the games, having Tennessee defense. Maybe if you have 6 or 7 teams, maybe you have that in like 2 or 3 of them, something like that. And you can still do a different team as you go, right? It's all about building your team when you have more information. Like, obviously you're building your team optimally for what you think before each game, but you still have to go in and make sure that you still feel that way after what has happened, basically, is the kind of the moral of the story. So multipliers, global swap equals negative AV. Yeah, I think that the global swap's viable if you're rolling out a ton of lineups. There's people that are doing it very well. Like, I'm actually really excited to talk with the Daily Roto guys, because I think that they're some of the guys that do multi-entry better than me for sure. So I'm excited to talk to them for golf. Obviously, Chad and Null Fan just crushing Showdown. They're doing some mass multi-entry better than almost anyone in that format. So yeah, it is viable in these type of slates. I think that it's harder to do because of correlation issues. So that would be my main concern with that side of things. So if we really wanted to kind of get into it from that spot, I think that that's what I really wanted to talk about. Steve, are we really prioritizing double position player stacks with our quarterbacks, these lineups? Yeah, it's the same kind of thing, right? Like you just need that main stack. If you want to learn more about how to be a profitable DFS player, make sure you hit that subscribe icon in the bottom right-hand corner so you don't miss anything. Have a bunch of DFS courses for other sports as well if you're looking to transfer away from NFL into some other sports on DraftKings and FanDuel. So check those out, and I'll see you guys on Twitch this weekend.